At issue this week, security and privacy. High-tech surveillance cameras can help catch criminals, but they're also raising concerns about the potential for abuse. Ahead, the action one company is taking and the safeguards lawmakers want to see in place. And data center debate. A new survey shows a recent surge in opposition to them. Ahead, how the issue is crossing party lines and keeping children safe online. The legal actions state and local officials in our area are taking to protect young people from social media addiction and other dangers.
NBC10 At Issue starts now.
I'm Lauren Make. Welcome to NBC10 At Issue. More and more police are turning to high-tech tools to fight crime, but some of those devices are raising privacy concerns. Flock Safety is the police tech company that makes a line of cameras that can track vehicle movements. On Thursday, it announced new safeguards. They include shortening the default time period that it holds people's movement data. It was 1 month. It will now be 1 week. And it's adding a new system that will lock out a user whose searches display, quote, abnormal activity. A spokesperson told NBC News that the changes are meant to help address privacy concerns and to stem officer abuse of the cameras. Here now to talk more about this is Adam Want, an attorney and expert in policing technology. He is an associate professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Professor Want, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
So let's talk about these license plate readers. First of all, let's set the stage. How have they become part of law enforcement investigations? How are they used?
Flock cameras are an interesting technology where they build a database of license plates and where they are driving over time. Law enforcement has become accustomed to be able to access flock databases, to be able to trace where cars have been in the past, and to be able to look in certain areas to see what cars have driven through that area.
So we are now hearing that Flock is going to be making some changes, putting in some restrictions on, for example, how long data can be kept for. What kind of impact could the changes that they are looking at make?
So there's two sides to the story. On one side of the story, law enforcement wants access to historical data to be able to trace and track suspects and criminal activity, because very often law enforcement doesn't find out about criminal activity for days, weeks, if not months afterwards. On the other side of the issue, the public is worried that there are data sets of where they have been driving for years. And somewhere in the middle lies a middle ground where we will be able to figure out what the correct data retention time is so that both law enforcement could use the technology while the public's a bit more comfortable knowing that there aren't years of their travels in a database.
So we are seeing some efforts for restrictions from lawmakers here in Pennsylvania, but these are used across the country. So if there ends up being a patchwork of laws, what kind of impact does that have on law enforcement and the ability to use these cameras?
Not having a national standard becomes a problem because it becomes a bit difficult to train law enforcement, and it becomes even a bit more difficult being that we're talking about vehicle license plate technology, and vehicles very often travel across state borders. So if this isn't a national standard, if this is done state by state, law enforcement in different states will have access to different amounts of data, and then very often law enforcement will have to rely on law enforcement agencies in different states to get them the data that they need. And because suspects very often travel interstate, that's very possible. The patchwork issue is a significant issue. It's an issue to be worried about because standards and national standards are much more, they're much easier to enforce. They're much easier to enforce transparency and accountability. And it's one of the things that we are worried about.
If there were to be a national standard, if Congress, for example, would say, hey, we want to take a look at this issue, what would be the things that you think would be doable?
I think as a nation, we need to have conversations about where these technologies should be employed, how they should be distributed, how they should be disclosed to the public. I think as a nation, we need to have conversations about how long this information should be retained. While it is certainly a good thing that Flock is going and reanalyzing their own internal protocols, this is really something that should be left up to the federal or state legislatures to figure out, not a private corporation. And if a national standard was something that was promulgated, I think that would be the best way forward.
All right. It is an issue we will continue to watch. We appreciate your perspective. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you for having me.
Flock announced it was making changes just days after Pennsylvania lawmakers announced plans to introduce legislation to regulate the cameras and how they are used. State Representative Tarek Khan, a Democrat from Philadelphia, joins us now. You have some legislation in the works. Before we get into that, let's kind of talk about the news of this with what Flock says that it is going to do on its own. What is your take on the changes that they are now planning?
Glad they're actually acknowledging that there's a problem, that this technology is being misused. And unfortunately, it had to take an investigative journalist from the Washington Post to sort of uncover this and to expose the widespread misuse of these cameras. And also legislators like ourselves introducing bills that are putting the brakes and making sure that safeguards are in place. So good step, but we need a lot more.
So what would the regulations look like if your bill, which I know is actually still in the works, if that were to be successful, what do you envision regulation looking like of these cameras? Yeah,
so we see these cameras have just exploded. There's over 120,000 Flock cameras, just Flock cameras nationwide, in just about every community, it seems like, across Pennsylvania and across the Commonwealth and across the entire nation, right? So we want to make sure first that people's data is being protected. We want to make sure that there are controls about who actually can access this data, how long that data can be stored, for what reason people can actually access the data, and then also set cause of actions if people have been harmed by this. We've been hearing stories of people being stalked, people being followed. This really is protected information that we need to make sure it does not get into the wrong hands. So this is sort of a transparency bill to make sure that we're actually able to see the audit trail that they have, making sure that there are privacy guardrails on this data, and then also right of action in case people are harmed or in case a DA and an AG wants to go after people for misusing it.
Would one law enforcement agency still be able to share the information with another law enforcement agency, whether it's in Pennsylvania or in another state?
Yeah, one of the great things about this issue is that you can be the adult in the room and say there is a reason for this technology, right? These cameras have been used to stop people who have abducted children. So when those Amber Alerts have come out, the Brown University shooter apparently was part identified because of this technology. Stolen cars, I talked to our local police chief, and he said that they use it for stolen cars. And we want that. We want people committing crimes. We want there to be accountability. We want to make sure that law enforcement has the tools that they need to do their job. But in the same token, we can't just let anyone that wants to access this data do it. We've seen that this is getting into the wrong hands, and we have. So I think this is sort of the fair way. And as we're working on the data, on the bill, we'll kind of see what the safeguards can be in terms of communication. But we don't want to actually impede a law enforcement officer actually pursuing an active crime case. We want it to stop crime. But we don't want the guardrails to be completely off, which they're almost all off now.
What if Pennsylvania decides, okay, these are the rules, and then New Jersey decides these are the rules, and Illinois decides these are the rules? How would that work? Yeah, well, I mean, it's basically how everything else happens that's not federally mandated. So we're hoping that the feds will take action. You are. Yeah, oh, absolutely, absolutely. Listen, this is a technology where, and there are other
areas of big tech where they just keep exploding things. We're seeing that, the data centers, I'm sure, a lot of people in my community are being very vocal about that. We need to make sure that there are clear safeguards to protect the public as this technology starts to unroll. It's sort of maybe not a great example, but I'm actually listening to the book Jurassic Park, and when we learn what happens when sort of technologies just sort of let run amok, the dinosaurs start eating people. So we have to make sure that this technology, we don't just let it get out. And unfortunately, a lot of onus is on a lot of responsibilities on these companies who sort of let this technology get out there. And we've seen at least 50 cases of this being vehemently, wrongly used.
Representative Tara Khan, great to see you.
Thanks, Lauren. Great talking to you.
Thanks.
Data center opinions. A new survey shows just how much the views of the public have changed in recent months. Ahead, what it could mean for the future of these projects.
This is NBC10 At Issue.
In our area and across the country, people have been expressing opposition to the construction of data centers in their area. In Upper Marion, Montgomery County this week, residents showed up at a meeting to share their opinions on a developer's plan to build a data center complex there.
Upper Marion's not willing to sacrifice residents' lives for data centers.
You know what? Money's not the be-all, end-all. Maybe he thinks that.
Residents expressed concerns about the potential health and environmental impacts and strain on the power grid. Now, developer Brian O'Neill defended his plan, saying it would comply with regulations and generate more than $50 million a year in new local tax revenue. At least one person at the meeting agreed with him.
The rejection of these data centers does not represent a community uniting to defend its interests, but rather ignorance and short-sightedness blocking long-term prosperity and human flourishing. Thank you. Thank you for your comments.
Opposition to data centers has grown in recent months. A new survey conducted by the Annenberg Public Policy Center of the University of Pennsylvania shows 61% of people are against having data centers in their area. That is up 12 points since a previous survey was conducted in February and March. And joining us now to discuss this survey is Matt Lewandowski. He is a professor of political science and communication at the Annenberg Public Policy Center at Penn. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And let's dig right into this. One of the things that was the most striking about this survey was how quickly that opposition has grown. Tell me more about what you found with that leap.
Yeah, one of the really interesting things is we thought this might have been connected to areas that have had contentious debates over data centers. And that doesn't really seem to be the case. This is quite widespread, and we've seen this increase in opposition, quite broadly. And we're still trying to dig into the data and plan a future wave of our study to try and unpack this a bit more. But some obvious contenders would be, for the reasons why it's increased so much, would be one, concern over, in particular, electricity prices. Alternatively, another part of it may just be that there's been much more media attention to these stories, and it's been very one-sided. So often we think about hearing from people who are for and against something, but by and large, almost everything we hear about the data centers is negative unless it's from the AI companies themselves. And so that may also explain why the public has moved so sharply against them in recent months.
This was especially notable to me, this jump, because I cover the political world, and we're seeing politicians on all levels, from the national down to county and town councils, react to this. And they were sometimes elected before these data centers came about. So voters didn't necessarily ask about them when they were elected, and now, they're sort of figuring out what their positions are on things. How unusual is it on any issue to see a shift this quickly in a matter of months?
It's pretty rare, and I think one of the really interesting things here has been the way this is truly a cross-partisan or bipartisan issue. There aren't very many issues where Ron DeSantis and Bernie Sanders line up on the same side of the issue, but this is one of them, which I think suggests that this is an issue where we'll see a lot of change. We'll continue to see a lot of change in the months and years to come, because one of the things we also found was that a supermajority of the public, again, across party lines, wants the government to do more to regulate AI. And so I think there's a real opening for both parties and politicians at all levels, right, to try and address this issue and think about how we can best respond to this change.
You also asked about how the government is handling this and what people want to see. Tell me what you found there.
Yeah. I don't think people have a clear sense yet of how they want the government to respond to this. I think in part because this is also new. These technologies are ones that, frankly, I think even the developers fully understand. But what's very clear what people want is they want more regulation of these technologies, more boundaries, more guidelines for them, because I think people do have real concerns around the environmental cost, around the economic cost, right? In particular, around what this might do to the job market, especially for younger folks, right? So I think there's a real desire from the public to think about, common sense regulations that politicians could put in place that might help these technologies develop in safer and more manageable ways.
You mentioned younger folks. That was another thing that was striking about this. It's the younger people who had more of an opposition than the older people.
Yeah, that is really interesting. It's something where we're just planning our next wave this morning. It's something we're thinking about. I don't have I can't give you a very clear answer, but my guess is, or my hypothesis would be that some of those younger people are also the ones who are experiencing a lot of angst over AI, right? When I talk to students about it, they're really worried about AI allowing them to kind of cognitively offload, not making their education not as effective as it would have been in a pre-AI era. They're worried about the potential for job market disruption. So I think for some of those folks, it might be that pessimism about AI is bleeding over into their opposition for data centers.
Interesting. All right. Interesting stuff. We will keep an eye on this. Professor Matt Lewandowski from the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Taking action to protect kids online. The actions local officials are taking to keep them safe when it comes to social media.
This is NBC10 At Issue.
There is new scrutiny on social media companies over how their platforms affect kids. This past week, officials in Pennsylvania and New Jersey made moves they say are designed to protect kids online. On Tuesday, New Jersey Governor Mikey Sherrill, a Democrat, signed several pieces of legislation that set new restrictions on the data that companies can collect on children. At the same time, Pennsylvania Attorney General Dave Sunday, a Republican, was announcing a lawsuit against TikTok, saying the platform misrepresents itself to get a rating that allows younger users and is designed to be addictive for them. Montgomery County is now joining more than 3,000 lawsuits accusing social media companies of failing to protect children and teens online. And joining us to discuss that is Jamila Winder, the chair of the Montgomery County Board of Commissioners. She is a Democrat. Thanks for joining us. Great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
So why is this something that you felt needed to be done at the county level?
Well, we have more than 180,000 young people that call Montgomery County home, and we prioritize the mental health and well-being of our residents. And we know that these social media companies and their platforms are highly addictive for our youth. And so we wanted to be a part of the solution in holding these companies accountable.
So if you are saying that these platforms are so harmful to children, and it is something that is worth a lawsuit and county resources, what does that mean for parents? What's your message to them? Are you telling parents not to let their kids use these platforms at all?
I'm not here to tell parents how to raise their children, but I know that I'm a parent myself. I have a 6- and 8-year-old at home, and we are often having these discussions about screen time and social media platforms, especially with my 8-year-old. What I am saying is that the research shows that 3 or more hours on one of these platforms could double the chances of depression among our youth in our community. And so we know that parents have to play a role in helping to safeguard their children, but these social media companies play a role in making sure their products are safe for our children.
What would be a win from this lawsuit? What would you consider to be successful in terms of what you could get out of it?
So, people certainly think about this lawsuit and relative to the money, but for us, this lawsuit is really about protecting young people and holding corporations accountable when their products contribute to their harm. And so a win for us would be that we see these companies make the necessary changes needed to warn families, warn users of the real effects of these platforms on the mental health and well-being of the people that use them. So we're just hoping to invoke change in the ways in which these companies disclose the harm, but also how they build these products.
I know that this is a process. We will be watching it play out. Thank you for the update where we are at this moment. Jamila Winder, Chair of Montgomery County Board of Commissioners. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We reached out to the social media companies named in the Montgomery County lawsuit. Meta told us, quote, "We strongly disagree with these allegations and are confident the evidence will show our longstanding commitment to supporting young people. We've listened to parents, worked with experts and law enforcement, and conducted in-depth research to understand the issues that matter most. We're proud of the progress we've made, and we're always working to do better," end quote. A Google spokesperson sent us a statement responding to that same lawsuit, which reads in part, quote, "In collaboration with youth, mental health, and parenting experts, we built services and policies to provide young people with age-appropriate experiences and parents with robust controls. The allegations in these complaints are simply not true," end quote. Snap and TikTok did not respond by the time of this taping, but on Tuesday, TikTok sent us this response to the actions of the Pennsylvania Attorney General. The statement from a TikTok spokesperson says in part, quote, "This lawsuit relies on misleading and inaccurate claims and deliberately ignores the concrete safety measures TikTok has voluntarily implemented to support the well-being of our community." We'll be right back.
This is NBC10 At Issue.
We're back now with a quick reminder. For more of my interviews with lawmakers, government officials, candidates, and other newsmakers, be sure to subscribe to my Battleground Politics podcast. New episodes are posted to NBC10.com, the NBC10 app, our NBC Philadelphia YouTube channel, and you can stream episodes wherever you get your podcasts. That does it for this edition of NBC10 At Issue. Thanks for joining us. Have a great day.